Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams. Daniel, good to see you.
Good morning, Dr. Paul.
Good. We have a special guest today, and he's been a friend of ours as well as a friend of Liberty and has been teaching Austrian economics for a long time. He's a professor at Pace University, and he's also the academic vice president of the Mises Institute. He has an MA and a PhD from Rutgers University, but most importantly, he is a close follower of Murray Rothbard. He believes in very limited government, if any, but he has come to Washington on a couple occasions for me when I was in Congress to testify. So I would like to welcome Joe Salerno to our meeting here today in our program.
Hello, Dr. Paul. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. You know, one of the reasons we wanted to visit with you today is you are the noted expert in the Austrian school on monetary policy. And most people think of money as things that we always just put in our pocket, and that is true. It used to be that we could always eventually put the money in our pocket, and that's what a true gold standard would be all about, is that you can always convert the note or the promise to pay into something of real value and put it into your pocket. But today we have a silly system of Federal Reserve notes. We can put them in our pockets, but it gives some people more freedom than our government likes. And you know, just as in the 30s, our government didn't like the freedom that people could actually keep their gold in their pockets to protect against runaway government, they had to crack down. And just think how many years in the 20th century we as Americans weren't even allowed to own gold. But here it is that the substitute is the dollar reserve standard, paper money, and some people still think that there's a little bit of freedom in holding cash, and I think this has been brought to our attention with the Greek crisis. So now it looks like some governments, and who knows, maybe even our government someday might attack the use of cash. This is something you've written about and talked about. How serious is this problem, and how do you see this playing out?
It's a very serious problem. Even though it's fiat money, the cash that we hold does give us anonymity. That is anonymity in our very private financial dealings. And the governments hate this. I mean, they began a war, so certainly the U.S. government initiated the war in 1970 with the Bank Secrecy Act. The aim, of course, the stated aim was to stop money laundering, prevent organized crime from flourishing, and so on. But really what it did was to open up the banks, to open up their records to federal agents and so on, so that they could track us. And I find this very disturbing, and it's only grown since the 1970s.
Well, and it looks like it's not just a U.S. problem, because people in Greece obviously were looking to hold their cash. But you know, the cash, I don't know if we have that chart on cash today. You know, our Federal Reserve has a chart, you know, from the St. Louis Fed to show the escalation of cash. And it's rather dramatic. That one little blip about 2/3 over is the blip on the year 2000 on Y2K. But look at the escalation, and it went up from 800 billion to 1.4 trillion dollars since this crisis hit. But I understand, and I wondered if this number is right, that only about 30% of these cash holdings are actually in the United States with American citizens, which raises the question, if we moved in that direction, don't they have an international challenge here, and how would this work? Is there any chance they could be successful without putting everybody in a concentration camp? It seems like it would be an overwhelming problem even for the authoritarians.
No, you're absolutely right. In fact, the Federal Reserve itself has done studies on this and found in the 80s and 90s that 2/3 of the cash was outside the country, of U.S. Paper dollars, and 80% of the $100 bills were being used outside the country in black markets for drug deals and so on. So it would be impossible for them to suppress all the cash without, as you said, you know, throwing everybody into some sort of concentration camp. They're very, very fearful of cash for a second reason, and that is that it really undermines our fractional reserve banks. It gives a power to the people that are holding the accounts in the banks. It allows them to withdraw at any time their cash. And this is something that the banks are against. We see Chase coming out with rules saying things like they're not going to accept cash in payment for your mortgage and credit cards, and that you're not permitted any longer to keep cash in your safe deposit boxes or coins.
You know, Professor.
So yeah, they have a big row to hoe.
Right.
I was just going to say, Professor, you know, something about holding cash intrinsically feels good. You know, I worked for a number of years overseas, and I would line up at the end of the month and get a big stack of cash. And so everything I purchased was completely anonymous. I did no business whatsoever electronically. Unfortunately, the trend now overseas in Europe, as you've pointed out, I think in several interviews you've given, is to move in this direction of a cashless society. You also mentioned, and I found this particularly interesting, is the war on cash is a way to sort of manipulate spending habits. If you get rid of cash, you can do things like negative interest rates and force people to spend at certain times and not at others. Is this something that you think is serious?
Yeah, yes, I think it is, because it's being pushed by very prominent mainstream economists who are in positions of power in the IMF and in the U.S. Lee Rogoff comes to mind, and other Willem Weeder comes to mind. They're pushing for an end to cash so that there can be manipulation of the of spending habits, as you put it. In fact, just yesterday or the day before, there was an article in which I think it was the Financial Times was calling cash a barbarous relic. So just as Keynes called gold a barbarous relic and wanted to stamp it out, and did succeed to a great extent in stamping it out, they're now going after cash. Keynes's heirs, the Keynesian macroeconomists, and this is very scary.
You know, the barbarous relic reminds me of what Henry Royce said in the 70s. If we ever legalize gold again, he said it didn't bother him any, because the market would drive the price of gold down to $5. So I guess that was an unintended consequence. Instead of going to 5, it didn't take too many years. It went up to 800. So, but what about this possibility or the danger of the control of cash as being so destructive to privacy, not only financial, but privacy in the sense of we have the NSA spying and doing everything whatsoever. But you know, if you had only control of your cash, where you had no chance to do something outside of the control of the government of every penny, that sounds like it could be as ominous as the NSA. But then again, what if they're working together? This could be, you know, a real clincher. Then they wouldn't even have to maybe, you know, call in all the cash around the world, because that would be devastating to the dollar. But they could put the controls here on us in the United States.
Yeah, I think that's true. And in fact, the French premier last year drew parallels between the war on terror and the war on cash. He said that you know, terrorists use cash to bomb Charles Hebdo and the Jewish supermarket, and so therefore, you know, cash was evil. But they also wore shoes, and they also wore clothing and used streets and so on. But you don't outlaw those things. So they're using the war on terror as a cover to get at cash.
Right.
And it's actually, as you've written, Professor, it's come home in a very concrete way. You mentioned before the Louisiana's ban on secondhand dealers. And to me, I mean, if you could explain that, it would be fascinating, I think, to the viewers who don't know about it. But it seems to me that this really will affect the poor much more disproportionately, because they tend to, I think, deal in cash more.
Yes, in Louisiana, what they did, it was in 2011. It sort of flew under the radar and became noticed last year. But anyway, the state legislature passed a law which mandated secondhand dealers, defined as Goodwill stores, flea markets, garage sales, to report any cash transactions, any transactions in which they were receiving or paying cash. And they had to report them on a daily basis to the local police authorities, who could, and also to get the seller's name, license plate number, and a number of other private details. And so this, you know, this is a first step. Fortunately, it's only on the state level. This would be awful if it was imposed on the federal level.
You know, the one other consequence that may come may show the evidence that real money might be able to override paper money, and that is, if they really crack down and they're able to and make it just horrible for you to spend a Federal Reserve note in this country, that maybe some transactions would occur with American silver dollars or gold dollars or whatnot, which again might be then made illegal. but at least it might be the market answer to it. If times were very chaotic, I believe they might do that. But right now, you know, they could, I believe, really crack down. They've gone through this conditioning process, which is both market-oriented as well as people liking the convenience. But a lot of people use cash for buying use a credit card for buying a Coke. I never believed that we would get to that point, but it's just so routine. But what do you think that if things got worse, do you think people would still possibly resort to gold and silver?
Yeah, no, I think actually a silver lining for us and an unintended consequence for them, for the powers that be, is that this war on cash could cause the remonetization of silver, the informal remonetization of silver and gold, and I would look forward to that. I mean, that would be a great benefit. I think Americans would do that.
Yeah. You know, the other group of people, Daniel mentioned about poor people being penalized. Well, already the elderly have been penalized with their savings because they don't make any interest. And when I've asked Federal Reserve Board chairmen on several occasions, different chairmen, they said, well, that's just one of the penalties that we have to put up with. They didn't deny that it was really hurting retired people, and they weren't earning any interest, and the market was saying interest should be 5, 6, or 7%. So they were penalizing, but we had to save the whole system. That is, you know, the financial Wall Street people, they want to say. But what about the immigrants? This might be something, this anti-immigration hectoring, you know, by the Republican candidates right now. They might like this because it's really going to hurt the immigrants, because a lot of immigrants, legal and illegal, come in here and they get paid in cash. This could have some economic consequences as well, and if they're able to crack down, it's going to penalize a lot of Americans, as well as it's going to be very anti-immigrant, which I guess some people might be satisfied with.
Yeah, I think you're right about the lower income people being hurt by this. I know in Italy is very resistant to this war against cash, at least the people are, because 1/3 of the people are poor and do not have bank accounts. So, and also in parts of rural Sweden, they've sort of resisted. And because it does hurt the lower income types that do not have other means of making transactions.
Well, what do you think is going to happen? Do you think there's going to be just this meandering with the talk and go on a long time, or do you think the current crisis might get a lot worse, where they could all of a sudden come down and think it is in their interest to crack down? How far out do you think that this might go before they, you know, do
Well,
this?
I mean, if the crisis becomes worse, I think what they're going to try to do is to impose these negative interest rates. You know, they floated the idea; it's been talked about in the press. The Financial Times was very in favor of it when it claimed that, you know, cash was a barbarous relic. It was preventing the Fed from using all the tools at its disposal. I think this could come in the next couple of years. You know, if they have to bail out the financial system again, which I don't know if they're going to be able to do, but that will be one of the things that they do. They'll lock the cash in the banks to prevent it from escaping and destabilizing these fractional reserve banks, which are still in a very fragile state.
Right. I have a couple of other questions, not directly related to the cashless society, but I wanted to get your opinion on this. And that is the way government manipulate the statistics. Generally, when I look at them, I look at them and try to interpret how the market might interpret them, but I don't believe, you know, what the government tells us is actually the case. And the two statistics, both economically speaking as well as manipulation by government, that would be the CPI. Why should we question, or should we question, the CPI as well as GDP figures? It seems like, boy, those are big issues. The CPI, you know, dictates if we could only get inflation rate up to 2%, it'll be magic. And then also, if the GDP is going up at a certain amount, everybody is happy. How do you see those two important statistics, at least for the financial markets?
I don't see them as being important to they're not, let's say, accurate. they don't genuinely reflect the amount of income being produced in the economy, that is the GDP, nor the rate of inflation in the economy. The CPI is deeply flawed. There's new products coming out all the time. There's higher quality products coming out all the time. They try to use these very, very sophisticated mathematical techniques to measure quality, which is inherently impossible. So what they do is basically anything they do always makes the inflation rate appear lower. So, if your car goes up by 10%, they say, well, you have new airbags or better airbags. So it didn't really go up by 10%. The cars only went up by 5%. So this is all arbitrary.
So you're probably not a fan of the Taylor rule. I wouldn't think so.
No, not at all.
Right.
It's just another way of manipulating the money supply.
Okay, we're going to have to go here in a minute or two, but I did want to ask you a little bit about your career. How many years have you actually been teaching students, and during that entire period were you always an Austrian economist?
Yeah, I've been teaching students since, as a graduate student, in 1974 I began teaching, and I had the fortune to meet Murray Rothbard very early in my graduate career. So, I've known Murray Rothbard, or I did know Murray Rothbard from 1972. So pretty much since I was a graduate student, I've been in Austria. Actually, even before that, I had heard of him in my undergraduate college. So I've been in Austria all that time, and I've been a friend of Murray's until he passed in 1995. And he inspired me, and I try to give to my students the lessons that he taught me.
Okay. How would you compare this average student that comes to your classes? Do they all have to, did you have courses where they were required to come to your class, or did everybody have to make a choice to come to your class?
Well, I have some of both. I mean, some are required courses, but some are, courses that I teach that are electives, and that they can choose me. And I've gotten a reputation as being an Austrian economist, though I don't flaunt it. I don't argue with my colleagues. I mean, I'm on very good terms, and the students come. What
have you noticed any difference between the average student coming to see you in the 70s, mid 70s, and of course there was exciting things going on there with the breakdown of Bretton Woods, versus students that come in now? How do you compare the students as far as them receiving the message of the Austrian school, and how do you see any significant difference?
The students coming in now are more career-oriented, but that also means that they're more clear-eyed about the future. They want to know what's going to happen with inflation. Are there going to be good jobs for them when they graduate or they get their MBA degrees? And so they are very willing to listen to different points of view now, especially since they feel that what's been going on up to this point during their lives has really failed to deliver to us a prosperous and high employment economy. So in that sense, I think I like the students better that I've had in the last decade or so.
Yeah. Well, Joe, we have to run now, but I want to thank you very much, being with us today. You've taught a lot of students. You'll never know how many of you've influenced and how much that message has spread. One time I had talked to Hans Sandholz about this, and he had influenced a lot of students over the years at Grove City, and many of those students, came through my congressional office. But you've done a lot of great work, and your work with the Mises Institute has been great. But thank you very much, because this will make the difference. You've heard me speak before, and you know my emphasis on education over politics. And the politicians will reflect the educational system and the attitude that people have in a relationship to what the role of government ought to be. So you're working in the minefields, and when you change these attitudes, and I happen to think things have changed very favorably. I get nice receptions on college campuses. So I think you're doing great work, and you should continue to do this and get as many new teachers out there as possible. That to me makes the difference. And if all you have to do is look at presidential campaigns, I don't know how I even went through that stuff, for so many years, but I was always hoping there'd be one or two people out there listening. But I want to thank you very much for being on today and all the hard work you've done for the cause of liberty. Thank you, everybody.
You're welcome, Dr.
And I want to thank everybody for tuning in to the Liberty Report, and come back soon.